In the summer of 2015, the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital looked, from the outside, like hundreds of other NHS wards across England. Soft lighting, incubators humming quietly, parents moving in and out with the careful reverence that comes from fear and hope existing side by side. Premature babies fought for breath measured in grams and milliliters. Nurses spoke in low voices. Lives were fragile, but fragility was expected here. What was not expected was death sudden, repeated, and unexplained. Lucy Letby was one of the nurses on duty. She was in her mid-20s, newly qualified compared to some colleagues, described by friends as quiet, conscientious, and devoted to her work. She decorated parents' rooms with handmade cards. She volunteered for extra shifts. She texted colleagues about patients she worried over after hours. In photographs later shown to jurors, she looked unremarkable, blonde hair, round face, the uniform of an NHS nurse worn without flair. Nothing about her suggested danger. That ordinariness would later become part of the shock. The first collapses did not announce themselves as crimes. Neonatal medicine deals constantly with the unexpected. Babies who seem stable can deteriorate in minutes. On paper, early 2015 showed nothing that could not be explained away by chance, by complexity, by the harsh realities of premature birth. But quietly, in the background, numbers were beginning to shift. Between June 2015 and June 2016, babies on the unit began to suffer sudden episodes of collapse. Some survived after frantic resuscitation. Others did not. These were not all extremely premature infants on the edge of viability. Some were improving. Some were due to be moved to lower dependency care. For experienced consultants, this pattern felt wrong, not dramatic at first, but unsettling. The ward responded as wards always do. Each death was reviewed. Notes were checked. Equipment was inspected. Possible infections were considered. The hospital conducted internal mortality reviews, but no single cause emerged. There was no outbreak pathogen, no obvious equipment failure. The unit was busy and under pressure, but that was not unusual. Staff were exhausted, but dedication was not in doubt. Lucy Letby was often present. That, too, initially meant nothing. She worked many shifts, especially nights. She was trained to care for the most vulnerable babies and was frequently assigned to high-dependency rooms. In a unit where staffing rosters overlap with most adverse events, coincidence is a dangerous word, easy to dismiss, easy to overinterpret. At first, it was dismissed. The baby's collapses shared strange features. Sudden drops in oxygen saturation, unexplained bleeding. In some cases, swelling of the abdomen. In others, unusual levels of insulin in the blood, causing dangerously low blood sugar. Each symptom alone could be rationalized. Together, they formed a picture that resisted simple explanation. Parents were left devastated and confused. They had been told their babies were improving. Some had held their child hours before they died. In later testimony, mothers described leaving the hospital, briefly going home to shower, to rest only to receive urgent calls telling them to return. Fathers spoke of standing helplessly while teams worked on their newborns, watching his life slip away without a reason they could understand. Behind the scenes, a few senior doctors began to talk among themselves, not in accusations, but in questions. Why were these collapses happening? Why now? Why here? And why did so many occur during night shifts? In June 2015, the death of a baby boy marked a turning point for at least one consultant. The child had been stable. His deterioration was sudden and catastrophic. The medical team could not explain it. When another baby died soon after, unease hardened into concern. By the time a third unexpected death occurred, some doctors felt they were no longer dealing with random tragedy. They raised the issue internally. Emails were sent. Meetings were requested. The idea that something or someone was harming babies was almost unthinkable. Accusing a colleague of intentional harm goes against the culture of medicine, built on trust and teamwork. The stakes were enormous. To be wrong would destroy careers and lives. To be right and silent would be unforgivable. Hospital management responded cautiously. Alternative explanations were explored again: staffing levels, training gaps, unit design. External reviews were considered. The suggestion that a nurse might be deliberately harming babies was treated as a last resort, bordering on impossible. Lucy Letby continued to work. She was not confronted. In fact, at times she was reassured. When doctors raised concerns about her presence at multiple collapses, management pushed back, arguing there was no concrete evidence. Statistics were debated. Correlation was not causation. The hospital feared panic, litigation, and reputational damage. Meanwhile, the ward carried on. Babies kept coming. Parents trusted the system with the most precious thing they had. In this environment, Letby's own behavior attracted little attention. She sent sympathy cards to grieving families, something not uncommon in neonatal care. She kept detailed notes about babies she cared for. She spoke warmly of her job. If anything, she seemed emotionally invested, sometimes too much so, sharing distress with colleagues after deaths. What no one on the ward could see was what would later be found elsewhere. Handwritten notes kept by Letby at her home, scribbled phrases of self-loathing and despair. "I am evil," one note read. Another said, "I killed him on purpose because I am not good enough." At the time these words were written, they were private, unseen, and their meaning unknown. Whether they were confessions, expressions of mental collapse, or something else entirely will become a central question years later. By early 2016, the number of unexplained incidents had reached a level that could no longer be quietly absorbed. Some consultants formally requested that Letby be removed from frontline duties while an investigation took place. Management resisted at first, then compromised. Letby was moved to administrative work, away from direct patient care, not as a disciplinary measure, but as a precaution. She was told it was temporary. Even then, the hospital did not contact the police. External reviews continued. Time passed. Families mourned. Staff carried guilt and doubt. The first phase of the story ends here, not with an arrest or an accusation, but with something more disturbing, a prolonged moment in which warning signs existed, lives have been lost, and yet certainty remained just out of reach. In that gap between suspicion and action lies much of the anger, grief, and controversy that would later surround the Lucy Letby case. This was not a story that began with a villain revealed. It began with trust, routine, and the slow realization that something inside a place meant to save lives was terribly wrong. By the time Lucy Letby was removed from clinical duties in the summer of 2016, the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital had already been changed by what had happened. Death had become a shadow that lingered even on quiet shifts. Doctors spoke more carefully. Nurses second-guessed themselves. Parents sensed attention, even if they were never told why it was there. What had once felt like a place of controlled urgency now carried an undercurrent of fear. For senior clinicians, the doubts were no longer abstract. They had begun to map incidents on spreadsheets and timelines, looking for clarity where instinct had failed them. Dates, names, bed numbers, staff rosters. Again and again, one detail kept resurfacing. Lucy Letby's name appeared with disturbing frequency next to the most serious collapses. It was not proof, but it was no longer ignorable. Several consultants formally escalated their concerns to hospital executives. They asked, in plain terms, whether the pattern suggested deliberate harm. The response they received would later become a major point of criticism. Management urged caution. They warned against jumping to conclusions. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence and the catastrophic implications of accusing a nurse of killing babies. There were discussions about morale, about legal exposure, about reputational damage to the trust. The doctors felt trapped. They were trained to identify risk and act decisively, yet here they were being told to step back. One consultant later described feeling as though he was shouting into a void. Each new collapse reinforces belief that time mattered, that hesitation carried a cost measured in lives. In parallel, the hospital commissioned reviews meant to offer reassurance. External experts were invited to examine mortality data. Some concluded that the unit's death rate, while higher than average, could be explained by case mix and staffing pressures. Others noted anomalies but stopped short of alleging foul play. These mixed findings gave management cover to delay involving the police. Lucy Letby, meanwhile, experienced a removal from clinical duties as a profound personal blow. She told friends she felt betrayed. She asked repeatedly to be returned to the ward. In emails later disclosed in court, she expressed frustration and confusion, insisting she had done nothing wrong. She was encouraged to take on training and auditing roles, to remain part of the team without direct patient contact. At the same time, Letby continued to communicate with some parents of babies who had died or survived collapses. She messaged them on social media, offering condolences, asking how they were coping. To some, this seemed compassionate. To others, viewed in hindsight, it felt deeply unsettling. Boundaries that once appeared kind now appear blurred. For the families, the silence was devastating. Parents were not told that deaths were being reviewed as potentially suspicious. They grieved in isolation, blaming themselves, blaming fate, searching their memories for signs they might have missed. Years later, some would say that the not knowing was almost as painful as the loss itself. By mid-2017, pressure finally reached a breaking point. The accumulation of concerns, combined with unresolved questions from reviews, forced the hospital to act. In May of that year, the Trust contacted Cheshire Police. It was a step taken quietly, without public announcement, but its significance was enormous. For the first time, the possibility that crimes had been committed was formally acknowledged. The police investigation was slow and methodical. Neonatal cases are among the most complex to investigate. There are no eyewitnesses. Victims cannot speak. Causes of death are often ambiguous, even in natural circumstances. Detectives work alongside medical experts, sifting through years of records. They examine blood tests, radiology reports, nursing notes, medication charts. They built timelines minute by minute. Lucy Letby was identified early as a person of interest, but she was not immediately arrested. Investigators needed more than suspicion. They needed a case that could withstand the scrutiny of a criminal court. Every alternative explanation had to be tested and excluded. In July 2018, Letby was arrested for the first time at her home. The arrest stunned the local community. A neonatal nurse, accused of harming babies, defied the public's instinctive understanding of who commits violent crime. Letby was released on bail after questioning. She returned home under a cloud of suspicion that few could imagine carrying. 2 further arrests followed in 2019 and 2020 as the investigation expanded. Each time, Letby maintained her innocence. She denied harming any child. She answered questions calmly. To investigators, her demeanor offered no clear answers. Guilt does not always look like guilt. As the police case grew, so did the list of alleged victims. What had begun as a cluster of unexplained deaths evolved into a sweeping allegation that Letby had murdered 7 babies and attempted to murder many more by injecting air into their bloodstream, overfeeding them with milk, or administering insulin to cause hypoglycemia. Each allegation was rooted in medical interpretation, in the reading of patterns invisible to laypeople. The decision to charge Letby came in 2022. By then, years had passed since the last death on the unit. Families who had waited in silence were finally told that criminal proceedings were underway. For some, it brought relief. For others, it reopened wounds they had barely survived. This second phase of the story is defined not by action, but by delay, by systems struggling to accept the unthinkable, by professionals caught between duty to patients and loyalty to colleagues, and by the heavy question that would soon dominate public debate. If the warning signs were there, why did it take so long to act? That question would hang over the trial, over the verdict, and over every discussion of whether justice, in this case, came too late for some of the smallest victims imaginable. When Lucy Letby's trial began at Manchester Crown Court in October 2022, it was immediately clear that this would not be a conventional murder case. There was no weapon, no CCTV footage, no eyewitness testimony of violence. Instead, The case would rise or fall on medical science, expert interpretation, and whether a jury could be persuaded that harm had been deliberately inflicted in a setting designed to save lives. The prosecution's task was formidable. They had to prove not only that babies had been harmed, but that the harm was intentional, that it was inflicted by Letby, and that alternative explanations, natural deterioration, rare complications, or systemic failures could be ruled out. Each count was, in effect, its own miniature trial, yet the prosecution also relied on pattern evidence, the idea that taken together, these events could not reasonably be coincidence. Jurors were guided through a relentless sequence of cases, baby after baby, charts projected on screens, blood gas readings, insulin levels, nursing logs. The courtroom became an extension of the neonatal unit, filled with acronyms and physiological detail. The prosecution asked the jury to pay attention not just to what happened, but when it happened and who was there. Central to the case were allegations of air embolism. Expert witnesses testified that several babies had suffered sudden collapses consistent with air being deliberately injected into their bloodstream. They pointed to unusual skin discoloration described as mottling or a marble rash that appeared and disappeared rapidly, a phenomenon they argue was characteristic of air embolus. In one case, an X-ray showed what the prosecution said was air in places it should not be. Another key strand involved insulin poisoning. 2 babies experienced profound hypoglycemia despite receiving no prescribed insulin. Blood tests later revealed abnormally high insulin levels with suppressed C-peptide, indicating synthetic insulin rather than natural production. The prosecution argued that insulin could only have been administered deliberately. Letby, they said, was a nurse with access to the intravenous lines at the relevant times. Feeding-related allegations followed. In some cases, babies' stomachs became grossly distended. The prosecution alleged that excessive amounts of milk or air had been forced into their stomachs, causing catastrophic collapse. Again, timing was crucial. Letby's presence, they argued, formed a recurring link. Throughout, the prosecution emphasized Letby's conduct. They highlighted her presence during collapses, her messages to colleagues, and her social media searches for parents of dead babies. They introduced the handwritten notes found at her home after her arrest. The jury saw enlarged images of phrases like, "I am evil, and I killed him on purpose." The prosecution framed these as admissions, written when Letby believed she was responsible for the deaths. The defense countered forcefully. They argued that the case was built on hindsight and assumption, that once Letby became the focus, everything was viewed through that lens. They attacked the reliability of pattern evidence, warning against a human tendency to see meaning where none exists. Defense experts challenged the prosecution's medical conclusions. They argued that air embolism is notoriously difficult to diagnose after death, and that the signs described could have other explanations. They suggested that fragile babies can deteriorate suddenly without warning, even when they appear stable. In relation to insulin, the defense questioned the handling and interpretation of blood samples, raising the possibility of contamination or error. Crucially, the defense pointed to systemic failures. The neonatal unit was understaffed. Doctors rotated frequently. Record keeping was inconsistent. Some babies were extremely premature or had underlying conditions that increased their risk. The defense suggested that the hospital, desperate for answers, had found a scapegoat rather than confronting uncomfortable truths about its own shortcomings. Lucy Letby took the stand in her own defense, a decision that placed her credibility directly before the jury. Over many days of testimony, she denied every allegation. She rejected the idea that she had ever harmed a baby. She said the notes found in her home reflected mental distress, not confession. She described feeling overwhelmed, blamed, and broken by the accusations. Under cross-examination, the prosecution pressed her on inconsistencies, on why she could not remember certain events but recalled others in detail, on why she had been present so often during critical incidents, on why she searched for parents online. Letby insisted there were innocent explanations for everything. She said she cared deeply and struggled emotionally when babies died. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy. Parents of victims sat listening to clinical descriptions of their children's final moments. Some wept, some stared ahead in silence. Jurors were asked to absorb not only technical evidence, but unimaginable grief. As months passed, the trial became a test of endurance as much as judgment. Legal arguments stretched into weeks. Jurors were reminded repeatedly that they must decide each count separately, based only on evidence, not emotion. Yet emotion was unavoidable. The idea that a nurse might deliberately harm infants struck at something primal. When closing speeches arrived, the prosecution framed the case as one of overwhelming coincidence. If Letby were innocent, so many collapses, so many during her shifts, so many with unusual features. They argued that the simplest explanation was deliberate harm. The defense urged caution. They reminded the jury that doubt was not a weakness, but a legal standard. That complex medicine does not become criminal simply because outcomes are tragic. That convicting someone on inference and pattern carried grave risk. By the time the jury retired to deliberate, the case had become more than a question of one woman's guilt. It had become a referendum on how far courts can and should go in interpreting medical evidence, and whether certainty is ever truly possible in cases where science itself leaves room for doubt. The answers would come soon, and whatever they were, they would reshape not only Lucy Letby's life, but the trust placed in systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. In August 2023, after more than 9 months of evidence and weeks of deliberation, the jury returned its verdicts. Lucy Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder others. For some counts, the jury could not reach verdicts, underscoring complexity and uncertainty that had haunted the case from beginning. But the overall conclusion was devastatingly clear. The court accepted that a neonatal nurse had deliberately harmed the children she was trusted to protect. When sentencing took place, the tone shifted from analysis to moral reckoning. The judge described Letby's actions as a campaign of cruelty against the most vulnerable. He spoke of the extreme harm inflicted not only on the babies but on their families, many of whom would carry unanswered questions and irreversible loss for the rest of their lives. Letby was given a whole life order life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was one of the harshest sentences available under English law, reserved for crimes of exceptional gravity. In court, Letby stood largely expressionless. She declined to attend the sentencing hearing in person, a decision that angered many families. To them, it felt like another denial, another moment where their pain went unanswered. Outside the courtroom, parents spoke publicly for the first time, some with controlled fury, others with quiet devastation. They described babies who would never grow up, siblings who would never be born, futures erased before they began. Yet the verdict did not close the story. Almost immediately, controversy followed. Supporters of Letby, including some medical professionals and legal commentators, began to question whether justice had truly been done. They argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial and statistical evidence. That pattern recognition, especially in hindsight, can mislead. That neonatal medicine is fraught with uncertainty, and that rare events do cluster by chance. They pointed to previous miscarriages of justice in the UK, where expert medical testimony had later been discredited. Central to the debate was the nature of the medical evidence. Critics questioned whether air embolism could be reliably diagnosed without direct observation or post-mortem confirmation. They revisited the insulin cases, scrutinizing laboratory procedures and chain of custody issues. They asked whether alternative explanations had been sufficiently excluded, or whether the desire for answers had hardened into certainty too quickly. Others focused on institutional failure. Why had the hospital taken so long to involve the police? Why were early warnings not acted on decisively? Could earlier intervention have saved lives or prevented a single nurse from becoming the sole focus of blame for a wider systemic collapse? These questions fed a growing unease at the trial, while lawful, might not have told the entire truth. For the families of victims, such doubts felt unbearable. To them, the evidence was not abstract. It was their lived reality. They had watched babies collapse inexplicably. They had trusted professionals who later expressed deep concern. The verdict, for many, offered a measure of validation that what they sensed was wrong had finally been acknowledged. Public speculation about innocence felt like a reopening of wounds. Letby herself continued to maintain her innocence. Appeals were launched and rejected. Requests for review were made. Each legal avenue reinforced the finality of her sentence, yet did little to quiet public debate. In prison, she would live out her life defined by the label the court had given her, a serial killer of newborns. Beyond the individual case, the impact rippled outward. The NHS faced renewed scrutiny over patient safety, whistleblowing culture, and how institutions respond to the unthinkable. The Countess of Chester Hospital commissioned further independent inquiries. Lessons were promised. Reforms were discussed. Whether those lessons would truly be learned remained an open question. The Lucy Letby case sits at an uneasy intersection of grief and doubt. It is a story of babies who never had a chance, of parents whose lives were shattered in hospital rooms meant for healing. It is also a story that forces society to confront uncomfortable limits of medical knowledge, of institutional courage, of certainty itself. For some, the verdict represents justice delivered, however late. For others, it represents a warning about how fragile truth can be when built on complex science and human interpretation. Both realities coexist, locked together by the same set of facts, the same courtroom, the same irreversible outcome. In the end, the case does not offer the comfort of clarity. It leaves behind a silence filled with unresolved questions, and a sentence that ensures one thing above all else, that this story, unlike the lives at its center, will not be forgotten.